Peter Jennings, you said Australia needs more cowboy and less kowtow. That's a pretty strong rebuke. Tell my viewers why.
I think for too long, as a country, we've been prepared to look the other way when Chinese bad behaviour has been damaging our strategic interests. That's all been done, Peter, in the name of making money and in the name of deepening a trade relationship. But I think what's become very clear to governments in light of the COVID crisis is that this is now starting to do real damage to our national security. So the purpose of my article in The Australian was to argue the case for a stronger national security approach on things like critical supplies of fuel, medical equipment, on things like ammunition for our defence forces, and in limiting the amount of critical infrastructure that can be bought, particularly by Chinese companies. So that's the cowboy, if you like. That is what I think is needed, is a bit more regard for our national security position and less of the soft language which would pretend that we have a fantastic relationship with China when clearly we do not.
There's a practicality with your position, and you say this very, very much in the Australian article. You say, we will still trade, we'll still take foreign investment, train overseas students, have research links, all of those things will still happen, but we need our eyes open on the national security and defence and intelligence relationship with China. We need to be alive to that. We need to have that honest national conversation. On the other side, those who want more and more economic ties and trade to be predominant, they don't want to talk about any downside to the China relationship. So there's a bit more balance, I'd say, in your position. And I've tried in recent weeks to get people to understand the level of debate that goes on behind closed doors, down the hill with the bureaucracy and on the hill with the parliamentarians about these two camps. I mean, it's a live debate in Canberra, in the Australian Parliament, about where you stand on China. One thing about COVID-19 is that debate's now out in the open.
It's revealed the Chinese Communist Party for the rather unpleasant organisation that it is, Peter. I mean, look, this is probably the debate of our generation. It is the one which I think is ultimately going to show if Australia can stand on its own 2 feet as a strong sovereign entity, or if we are in some way prepared to take on subordinate status, because that's what China wants of countries in the Asia-Pacific region. Now, we have over a generation allowed Australian growth, or seen Australian growth as a result of the growth of the Chinese economy. But I think we made a fatal mistake, which was to imagine that as China grew rich, it was going to become more open, potentially more democratic, more reasonable to deal with, a country that maybe looks a little bit like a very large Singapore. But that hasn't happened. China has become more authoritarian, more Leninist, more assertive. It's now following this up with a type of diplomacy which is very much my way or the highway. You either completely agree with them or they're going to attack you. And I just think that this is ultimately going to be very counterproductive for China's position internationally. But for Australia, what we have to worry about is our sovereign interests, and that requires our government, I think, to be, shall we say, polite but firm when it comes to dealing with China, and drawing some red lines about things that we are prepared to do and the things that we just simply can't countenance, which includes, a large volume of Chinese state-owned entity and company ownership of Australian critical infrastructure. I think a lot of that will now have to be unpicked over time.
Yeah, well, just on that, because before you came to the role you're in now, you had a very senior role in the Defence Department. You looked at strategic issues inside Defence. You write here, you hope a military crisis doesn't eventuate, but would be mad not to be thinking through the consequences if one did. Now, we're not talking about mainland China here. I think we all come back to the issue in Taiwan. What would happen if China was to move on Taiwan?
I think there's a very real possibility that as Xi Jinping tries to distract domestic Chinese attention away from the failings of the Communist Party in handling the virus, that what he will do is try to create an international crisis that has a sort of nationalist rally round the flag effect on the part of the Chinese population. And the most obvious one to look at, if you're considering those sorts of possibilities, is a crisis over the Straits of Taiwan. Next year, about mid-year, is actually the 100th anniversary of the foundation of the Chinese Communist Party. Xi Jinping has announced that this is a critical 100th anniversary for China. And I think we will see an almost artificial crisis created over the Taiwan Straits. Perhaps not immediately a conflict, but a blockade, something which is reasserting China's control or China's wish for Taiwan to be part of the Chinese system. So that's a possibility, Peter. The other thing to worry about, of course, is the South China Sea, where, you know, there is quite literally a risk of aircraft being shot out of the sky or ships sunk as a result of the very assertive military posture that China has taken into literally annexing about 80% of the South China Sea. That's roughly the size of the Mediterranean, and saying that this is now internal Chinese territory. So, you know, there are at least two areas, in fact, there are a few more, where you could see military brinksmanship creating a crisis in the very short term.
Yeah, and one of the concerns, I share this concern, I know you wrote about it as well, is that our political parties, both sides, get enormous pressure from business to shut up and take the money. And these sorts of discussions and strategic plans and developments and conversations with like-minded allies have to happen, and they have to happen even if it risks the trade relationship, because it's incredibly important. You don't have to understate that. It's interesting, you know, isn't it? When we had a Cold War with the Soviet bloc, we didn't have Russian students in Australia in great number. We certainly didn't have Russian migrants and Russian investment, but we have all of that from China now. We didn't allow it from Russia because we thought it would compromise our national security, but as I said, you know, shut up and take the money. That's been our attitude with China for some time, certainly amongst business circles. You talked a minute ago about foreign ownership, more so than foreign investment, and I'm with you on that point. What needs to change?
Well, we need to stop allowing Chinese companies to buy into too many areas of critical infrastructure. The electricity grid, the gas network, ports, airports, medical facilities, farmland. You know, there needs to be, I think, a recognition that in dealing with Chinese companies, ultimately you are dealing with the Chinese Communist Party. It's not a capitalist society that operates in ways that Australia does. And there is such a thing as too much interconnectedness. I think we can go back to a simpler type of trade relationship with China. We can welcome their tourists. We probably need to see fewer students at Australian universities, because it is giving our own universities a very unhealthy dependence on Chinese money. But you know, that is going to be what I think we'll see over the next few years, as a gradual delinking of parts of our economy and research infrastructure. And on that, Peter, I'd say, you know, our governments need to do a better job of talking to the business community, talking to the state governments and the university sectors to, in some ways, bring them into understanding the national security challenge. It is not the case that the business interest. Yeah, exactly right. I mean, the signing up to the Belt and Road Initiative was something that happened quite deliberately, because China knows they have more luck with a state government than the federal government on that issue.
Craven,
and of course, state governments have.
I might get you back if I can, Peter, because I'd like to talk about the Belt and Road. I get a lot of emails from viewers saying we sort of understand what it is, but we don't understand its impact. We understand it's concerning, but we'd like to know more details. So I'll do that in the next little while if I can. Thank you very much for your time tonight.